There are places where the earth holds its breath, places where stone remembers what paper was forced to forget, where walls still whisper in languages that no living throat has spoken for centuries, where the very ground beneath your feet pulses with the weight of stories deliberately silenced. These are not the monuments celebrated in travel guides, or the ruins mapped by eager tourists with their cameras and comfortable certainties. These are the other places, the shadowed corners tucked between the chapters of history that made it into the textbooks, the buried truths that someone, somewhere, at some point in the long human story, decided you were not meant to know. What you're about to hear is not comfortable. It is not the tidy narrative of human progress marching steadily from darkness toward enlightenment. It is something older, stranger, and far more unsettling. A journey through the forbidden archives of our collective past, through sunken cities that should not exist in the depths where they were found, through codices burned by conquerors who feared what the pages contained, through underground networks carved into living rock by hands that left no names, through artifacts that sit in museum basements precisely because they raise questions no institution wishes to answer. This is the history that history forgot, sometimes by accident, often by design, always for reasons that remain, even now, maddeningly unclear. Why were certain truths buried? Who decided which civilizations would echo through eternity, and which would fade into whispers? What knowledge was so dangerous that it had to be scattered to the winds, drowned beneath rising seas, or locked away in vaults where only a handful of eyes would ever see it again? These questions have no easy answers. Perhaps they have no answers at all, at least none that those who know would willingly share. But the stones remember, the water remembers, and if you listen closely enough, the silence itself begins to speak. So settle in, let the world around you grow quiet, and allow yourself to step through the doorway that stands perpetually ajar at the edge of everything you thought you knew. Beyond it lies not certainty, but wonder, not resolution, but the kind of profound, aching mystery that makes being human such a strange and extraordinary thing. Let us begin where all good journeys into shadow must, at the threshold between worlds, at a place where land meets water and the boundary between what is known and what was deliberately forgotten grows impossibly thin. Beneath the cerulean waters of the Bay of Cambay, off the western coast of India, there lies something that should not be there. The local fishermen had always known about it, those strange formations that their nets would sometimes snag upon, the geometric shapes their depth sounders would occasionally detect, shapes too regular, too purposeful to be the work of current and time alone. But it was not until the year 2001 that marine scientists mapping the seafloor for an entirely unrelated project discovered what decades of local whispers had suggested, but official science had ignored. 200 feet below the surface, in waters murky with sediment and the suspended memory of ages, their instruments revealed the unmistakable outline of a city. Not a natural formation that resembled a city. Not a pile of rubble that might, if one squinted generously, suggest human habitation. A city, with grid-patterned streets stretching nearly 5 miles in length, with what appeared to be the foundations of buildings, with stone walls and carved basins and structures that bore the deliberate geometry of human planning. The discovery was extraordinary enough on its own terms, but what made it genuinely disturbing, what sent tremors through certain academic circles, while being quietly ignored by others, was the question of when. The Bay of Cambay has not always been a bay. Like much of the world's coastline, it has shifted and transformed over the long millennia, sometimes above the waves, sometimes beneath them. For this city to be resting at its current depth, for its streets and walls to lie where no land has existed within recorded history, the site would have to predate the end of the last ice age, not by centuries, by thousands of years. The most conservative estimates place the city's submersion at nearly 7,000 years before the present. The more troubling calculations, based on the rate of sea level rise in the region, and the depth at which the structures were found, suggested something closer to 9,000 years, perhaps older still. This was a city that, if the water remembered correctly, had thrived and built and planned and lived, while the pyramids of Egypt were still millennia away from being imagined, while Mesopotamia was nothing but scattered villages, while the very concept of civilization as mainstream history understands it had not yet crystallized into the societies we are taught to consider humanity's first. Yet there it was, beneath the waves, stubbornly existing. Artifacts dredged from the site only deepened the enigma. Pieces of wood, fragments of pottery, what appeared to be human bones, all of them subjected to carbon dating that returned ages matching the impossible timeline the water suggested. And then there were the stones themselves, blocks that showed evidence of tooling, of shaping, of deliberate placement by hands that had vanished so long ago that even their bones had turned to scattered minerals in the silt. The discovery was announced with appropriate academic caution. Papers were published, conferences were held, and then, with the gentle but inexorable motion of sand covering a footprint, the city beneath the Bay of Cambay began to fade from public discourse. Funding for further exploration proved difficult to secure. Questions about the site's implications for the timeline of human civilization were met with polite deflection or outright dismissal. The fishermen continued to snag their nets on the same formations they had always known about, and the water continued to hold its secrets in patient, salt-stained darkness. One might ask why such a discovery would not reshape our understanding of the past. One might wonder why museums do not prominently display the artifacts, why schoolchildren do not learn about the drowned metropolis that rewrites the story of human achievement. One might even venture to suggest that the silence itself is a kind of answer, that some truths are simply too inconvenient for the neat narratives we have constructed, too destabilizing for the foundations upon which careers and reputations have been built. But the Bay of Cambay is not alone in its submerged secrets. It is merely one chapter in a waterlogged library that spans the globe, one voice in a chorus of drowned cities that call out from beneath the waves. To the west, in the waters of the Mediterranean, similar patterns emerge. Off the coast of modern-day Turkey, beneath the blue expanse that ancient Greeks sailed with such confidence, lie the ruins of structures that predate any civilization those Greeks would have recognized. Submerged stone circles, aligned with precision that suggests careful astronomical observation, rest on sea floors that have not been dry land for thousands upon thousands of years. Who built them? For what purpose? And why do we hear so little about discoveries that should, by any reasonable measure, transform our understanding of the human story? The pattern repeats in Japanese waters, where the so-called Yonaguni monument has sparked decades of fierce debate. Discovered by a diving instructor in 1986, the massive underwater structure off the coast of Yonaguni Island presents a face of right angles and flat surfaces, of what appear to be carved steps and terraced platforms, of shapes that seem to defy the random erosion of water and time. Geologists have lined up on both sides of the argument, some insisting the formation is entirely natural, a product of the particular fracturing patterns of the local sandstone, others pointing to the uncanny regularity of its features, the apparent pathways and what some have interpreted as carved symbols on its surfaces. What no one disputes is the timeline. If the Yonaguni monument is artificial, if human hands shaped even a portion of its massive form, those hands would have worked above water during the last ice age, when sea levels were low enough to expose the seafloor where it now rests. The implication is the same as that whispered by the Bay of Cambay, the same as that suggested by submerged sites scattered across the Mediterranean and the Caribbean and the distant reaches of the Pacific. Civilization, or at least deliberate construction on a scale requiring organisation and skill, may have existed far earlier than the timeline we have been given allows. Why does this matter? Why should the age of a drowned ruin beneath distant waters concern anyone alive today? Because history is not merely a record of the past. History is a tool, a story we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from, a foundation upon which entire systems of meaning and power have been constructed. To change that story, even slightly, is to shake the ground beneath institutions that have invested centuries in being the arbiters of truth. To suggest that complex societies rose and fell before the officially recognised cradles of civilization is to ask uncomfortable questions about what else we might have been wrong about what other certainties might prove to be sand rather than stone, and so the water keeps its secrets, disturbed only occasionally by the curiosity of researchers working at the margins, their findings published in journals read by the few and forgotten by the many. But let us rise from the depths and turn our attention to another kind of burial, not beneath water, but beneath fire, not drowned by rising seas, but consumed by deliberate flames. The year is 1562, and the place is the Yucatan Peninsula, where the humid air hangs heavy with the scent of smoke and blood and the ashes of a civilization's memory. Bishop Diego de Landa stands before a pyre in the town of Mani, watching as his soldiers feed the flames with bundle after bundle of painted bark, with rolled documents covered in glyphs that writhe and twist in the heat before crumbling to grey nothing. Thousands of volumes, the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the astronomical tables and historical records and sacred narratives of the Maya, all of it reduced to smoke that rises toward a sky the gods themselves seem to have abandoned. Landa will later claim he burned these codices because they contain nothing but lies and superstition of the devil. He will write his own account of Maya culture, ironically preserving some of the very knowledge he sought to destroy, while ensuring that the vast majority of it would be lost forever. But what exactly was in those burning pages? What knowledge was so threatening that it had to be erased so completely? We know frustratingly little. Of the countless Maya books that existed before the conquest, only 4 confirmed codices survived, scattered fragments that hint at a tradition of learning so sophisticated that modern scholars have spent lifetimes attempting to reconstruct even its basic outlines. The Dresden Codex contains astronomical calculations of such precision that they accurately predicted eclipses and tracked the movement of Venus with an accuracy that European astronomy would not match for centuries. The Madrid Codex preserves ritual calendars and divinatory tables that suggest an understanding of time as cyclical, layered and complex, a vision of the universe where past and future were not separate territories but intimately entwined. The Paris Codex and the fragmentary Grolier Codex offer tantalizing glimpses of historical chronicles and astronomical tables, enough to suggest the staggering scope of what was lost. But these survivors represent a tiny fraction of a library that once stretched across the Maya world. Every major city, every temple complex, every lineage of priests and scribes maintained their own collections, books that recorded the movements of the stars, the deeds of kings, the proper rituals for planting and harvesting, the songs that kept the cosmos in motion, and nearly all of it burned. Why? The official answer is religious fervour, the conviction of Spanish conquistadors and clerics that indigenous belief systems were demonic obstacles to salvation that had to be swept aside. And there is truth in this explanation, truth enough to account for much of the destruction that swept through the Americas in the centuries following contact. But religious fervour alone does not explain everything. It does not explain why certain manuscripts were selectively preserved, while others were destroyed, why some knowledge was deemed merely superstitious, while other knowledge was treated as genuinely dangerous. It does not explain the reports, fragmentary and disputed but persistent, of Maya books that contained histories stretching back tens of thousands of years, that described previous ages of humanity, that recorded cataclysms and beginnings that made the conqueror's own sacred timeline look uncomfortably narrow. Perhaps the burning was simply thorough and indiscriminate. Perhaps the flames consumed equally the mundane and the profound, leaving only chance to determine which fragments would survive. Or perhaps, as some have whispered in the centuries since, the most dangerous books were the first to burn, the volumes that challenged not merely indigenous religion, but the very foundations of the world view the conquerors carried with them across the ocean. We will never know what was in those pages. The smoke has long since dispersed, the ashes scattered and absorbed into the soil of a land that remembers even what the official record has forgotten. But the pattern is worth noting, the same pattern that appears wherever we look closely at the interfaces between conqueror and conquered, between the history that survives and the history that was made to disappear. The Spanish were not unique in their burning, they were merely thorough. Across the globe and throughout the ages, the deliberate destruction of accumulated knowledge has been a favoured tool of those who wish to reshape the world according to their vision. The Library of Alexandria, that mythical repository of ancient wisdom, suffered multiple destructions at the hands of Roman soldiers, Christian mobs, and possibly Muslim conquerors, though scholars argue fiercely about the details. The libraries of Baghdad, once the intellectual centre of the Islamic world, were destroyed so completely by Mongol invaders that it was said the Tigris River ran black with the ink of ruined books. The monasteries of Tibet, repositories of centuries of Buddhist scholarship, were systematically looted and burned during the Chinese occupation of the 20th century. What connects these burnings? What unites the flames that consumed Maya codices with those that devoured the scrolls of Alexandria, the volumes of Baghdad, the texts of Tibet? The obvious answer is power. Knowledge is power, and controlling knowledge is controlling the shape of possible futures. Burn a people's history and you burn their sense of continuity with the past, their understanding of who they are and where they came from, their ability to imagine alternatives to the present. Every conqueror knows this instinctively, which is why the destruction of libraries so often accompanies the destruction of bodies. The smoke of burning books is the incense of new regimes. But there is another answer, one that sits less comfortably in the frameworks of political analysis. Perhaps some knowledge was not destroyed for what it gave to the conquered, but for what it threatened in the conqueror. Perhaps certain texts contained not merely the history and wisdom of indigenous peoples, but claims about the nature of reality itself, about the age and origins of humanity, about events and capabilities that challenged the assumptions on which the conqueror's own worldview depended. This is speculation, of course. We cannot know what was in books that no longer exist. We can only note the patterns, the suspicious completeness of certain destructions, the way some knowledge seems to have been targeted with particular intensity, while other knowledge was allowed to survive. And we can ask the questions that the silences themselves seem to pose. Let us descend now, not beneath water, but beneath stone, into the underground worlds that honeycomb the earth across continents and centuries, places carved from living rock by hands that left few other traces of their passing. In the heart of Turkey's Cappadocia region, where wind and water have sculpted the soft volcanic tuff into fantastical formations, there exists a world beneath the world. Derinkuyu, meaning deep well, is the name given to the most extensive of these subterranean cities, though extensive barely begins to describe what waits in the darkness below. 18 stories deep, capable of sheltering an estimated 20,000 people, along with their livestock and food stores, Derinkuyu is a masterpiece of ancient engineering that defies casual explanation. Ventilation shafts pierce the rock for hundreds of feet, providing fresh air to chambers buried far below the reach of daylight. Rolling stone doors, weighing half a ton or more, could be moved from inside to seal off entire sections from intruders above. Schools, chapels, wineries and stables occupied different levels, connected by narrow passages designed so that a single defender could hold off multiple attackers. Water wells reached deep into the earth, ensuring supplies even during extended sieges. The entire complex was a self-contained world, built to allow thousands of people to disappear beneath the surface and wait out whatever catastrophe raged in the sunlight above. But wait out what exactly? And for how long? The conventional explanation holds that these underground cities were built over centuries, expanded gradually by various populations seeking refuge from periodic invasions. The Hittites may have begun the digging, the Phrygians likely expanded the work, Byzantine Christians certainly used the spaces during Arab raids, and later populations continued to shelter there during times of turmoil. This timeline makes sense, accounts for the evidence, and sits comfortably within the established frameworks of Anatolian history. Yet certain aspects of Derinkuyu and its sister cities continue to invite deeper reflection. The scale of the excavation is staggering. Millions of cubic feet of rock were removed from these complexes, carved away by hand tools and carried to the surface through narrow passages. The labour involved defies casual estimation, representing generations of sustained effort, all to create spaces that, according to the standard timeline, were used only sporadically during brief periods of danger. Why would any society invest such extraordinary resources in refuge spaces that might go unused for decades at a time? What kind of threat would justify not merely shelters, but entire underground civilizations, complete with the infrastructure for permanent habitation? The ventilation systems present another puzzle. The shafts that provide air to the deepest chambers are not random holes, but carefully engineered channels, angled and positioned to create circulation patterns that keep the air fresh, even at depths where natural ventilation would be impossible. This is not intuitive knowledge. This is expertise, an understanding of airflow and pressure differentials that suggests either remarkable trial and error experimentation or the application of principles already known. And then there is the question of the stone doors, those massive rolling discs that could seal entire sections from the inside. They were designed not merely to keep invaders out, but to allow those below to control access, to close themselves in and wait. Wait for what? What threat required such elaborate defences that the builders assumed they might need to survive sealed underground for extended periods? The conventional answer points to the various invasions that swept through Anatolia over the millennia, armies that came and went with the regularity of seasons. but the scale of Derinkuyu suggests preparation for something more than periodic military campaigns. It suggests anticipation of catastrophe, of events that might make the surface world uninhabitable for long stretches of time. Similar underground complexes exist across the region, connected in some cases by miles of tunnels, creating a network of subterranean refuges that spans a significant portion of central Turkey. Estimates suggest there may be as many as 200 underground cities in Cappadocia alone, many of them still unexplored, their full extent unknown. What drove this ancient population to burrow so deeply, so extensively into the earth? What memory or anticipation shaped their decisions, generation after generation? The ground remembers, even if the official record does not. And the patterns repeat in other places, on other continents, wherever we look for traces of humanity's response to whatever catastrophes shaped the deep past. In the mountains of the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans carved elaborate cliff dwellings into the sandstone faces, accessible only by ladders or handholds that could be removed to prevent access from below. In the volcanic highlands of Ethiopia, rock-cut churches plunge into the earth, their interiors carved from living stone rather than built from blocks, as if the builders sought to merge their sacred spaces with the body of the planet itself. Beneath the streets of Paris lie miles of tunnels and ossuaries, the famous catacombs, but also older passages whose origins remain disputed. Beneath Edinburgh, beneath London, beneath cities across the world, there are networks and chambers that predate the structures above them, spaces that were old when the current cities were founded. What were they hiding from, these builders who chose to burrow rather than rise? What did they know, or remember, or fear that drove them into the patient darkness below? Perhaps they were merely practical people responding to practical threats. Perhaps every underground complex can be explained by local circumstances, by invaders here and persecution there, by the simple desire for cool storage space in hot climates, or the abundance of easily worked rock in certain geological formations. Each explanation, taken individually, makes sense, but taken together, the pattern suggests something else. It suggests a recurring human impulse to prepare for catastrophe, to build refuges against disasters that might require long-term survival underground. And it raises the question of where that impulse came from. What ancestral memory or transmitted warning shaped decisions across such distant times and places? The answer, if there is one, may lie not in the underground cities themselves, but in the artifacts that sometimes surface from their depths, objects that carry their own cargo of mystery. Consider for a moment the problem of the Antikythera mechanism. Pulled from the wreck of a Roman-era ship in 1900, this corroded lump of bronze seemed unremarkable at first, just another piece of debris from a vessel that had sunk near the Greek island of Antikythera sometime in the 1st century before the Common Era. It took decades for researchers to realise what they had found, and decades more to understand even a fraction of its implications. The Antikythera mechanism was a computer. Not a computer in the modern sense, with circuits and processors and glowing screens, but a mechanical computer, an intricate assembly of bronze gears and dials designed to calculate and display the positions of the sun, moon, and planets, to track the cycles of the Greek calendar, to predict eclipses with an accuracy that would not be matched by European technology for another 1,500 years. More than 30 interlocking gears, some of them with teeth so fine that they required sophisticated metalworking techniques to produce, worked together in a device small enough to fit in a shoebox, a device that represented technological achievements centuries ahead of anything else from the ancient Mediterranean. Where did it come from? Who built it? And perhaps more importantly, where did the knowledge go? The mainstream explanation suggests that the mechanism was a product of Greek astronomical and mechanical genius, possibly associated with the island of Rhodes, or the lineage of scholars that included Archimedes himself. This explanation is almost certainly correct in its broad outlines. The device uses known Greek astronomical models, its inscriptions are in Greek, and its construction is consistent with what we know of Greek metalworking capabilities at their height. But this explanation raises as many questions as it answers. If such sophisticated devices existed in the ancient world, why do we have only this single example? Where are the earlier versions, the experimental prototypes, the subsequent improvements that any technological tradition would produce? The Antikythera mechanism appears in the archaeological record like a visitor from another time, fully formed and without clear precedent, only to vanish again as if it had never existed. The conventional response is that such devices were rare, expensive and fragile, that most were melted down or destroyed over the centuries, that the one we have survived only because it was preserved in the oxygen-poor environment of a shipwreck. This is plausible. It may even be true. But it does not quite explain the technological discontinuity the device represents, the way its sophistication so dramatically exceeds anything else we have from the same era. Could it be that the mechanism was not the pinnacle of Greek achievement, but rather a pale echo of something older, a reconstruction or simplification of principles that had once been more fully developed? Could the gears and calculations it embodies represent not the cutting edge of ancient science, but the fragmentary survival of knowledge that had already begun to fade? These questions cannot be answered with certainty. The device sits in its museum case, its bronze gears frozen in position, offering no testimony beyond its own impossible existence. But it serves as a reminder that the past may have been more sophisticated than we assume, that the story of human technological development may not be the steady upward climb the textbooks describe. Similar discontinuities appear wherever we look closely. The concrete used by Roman engineers, capable of surviving 2,000 years of exposure to seawater that would destroy modern concrete in decades, remains the subject of ongoing research precisely because we do not fully understand how it was made. The steel produced by medieval Indian smiths, the famous Wootz steel that became Damascus steel in the hands of Arab swordsmiths, contained carbon nanotubes that would not be intentionally produced by Western science until the 20th century. Greek fire, the incendiary weapon that allowed Byzantine forces to repel invasion for centuries, was so secret that its formula was lost when Constantinople fell, and modern chemists can only guess at its composition. These are not fringe claims or pseudoscientific speculation. These are acknowledged mysteries, gaps in our understanding of ancient technology that mainstream scholarship openly admits it cannot fully explain. And if such gaps exist in the relatively well-documented histories of Greece and Rome, of India and Byzantium, how much larger must the gaps be in the histories of civilizations that left fewer records, that suffered more complete destruction, that were more thoroughly erased by the tides of time and conquest? The pattern suggests a disturbing possibility, that technological knowledge has not simply accumulated over the centuries, but has risen and fallen, advanced and retreated, been discovered and lost, and sometimes rediscovered again. The straight line of progress we imagine when we think of human history may be an illusion, a story we tell ourselves because it is simpler and more flattering than the alternative. What if the alternative is something closer to a series of cycles, civilizations rising to heights we can barely imagine before falling back into darkness, taking most of their knowledge with them? What if the survivors, the few who made it through whatever catastrophes ended each cycle, carried only fragments of what had been known, fragments that became the seeds of the next flowering, only to be lost again when that flowering too met its end? This is the possibility that whispers from the drowned cities, from the burned libraries, from the underground refuges, from the artifacts that sit uneasily in their museum cases. It's not a comfortable possibility. It offers no reassurance that our own civilization is different, that our knowledge is secure, that the darkness that consumed our predecessors cannot touch us. But perhaps comfort is not what we should be seeking. Perhaps what we need instead is awareness, attention to the patterns that repeat across the long human story, willingness to ask questions that do not have easy answers. The stones remember, even when we prefer to forget. Let us follow their memory now to one of the most enigmatic places on Earth, a site that has generated more theories, more arguments, and more sheer bewilderment than perhaps any other ancient monument. The Giza Plateau rises from the Egyptian sands like a challenge and a question, its great pyramids throwing shadows across a landscape that has been studied, measured, argued over, and speculated about for centuries. Everyone knows the pyramids. They appear on postcards and in movies, on currency and in documentaries, their shapes so familiar that we sometimes forget how genuinely strange they are. Consider for a moment what it actually means to build a great pyramid. 2.3 million stone blocks, some of them weighing more than 50 tons, quarried from limestone beds and granite deposits, transported across miles of desert and floodplain, raised to heights of nearly 500 feet, and fitted together with a precision that still astonishes engineers who examine the joints today. The base of the Great Pyramid is level to within less than an inch, across an area of 13 acres, an achievement that modern surveying equipment would struggle to replicate. The monument is lined to true north with an accuracy of less than a tenth of a degree, better than the alignment of the Greenwich Observatory that serves as the global reference for our navigation systems. Mainstream archaeology tells us this was accomplished by a workforce of perhaps 20,000 labourers, organised into teams that quarried and transported and lifted for roughly 20 years during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu in the 26th century before the Common Era. The timeline allows for approximately 12 blocks to be placed per hour, every hour, day and night, for 2 decades straight. This is possible, technically, assuming perfect organisation, no delays, and a consistent supply of labour and materials that any modern project manager would envy. But questions persist. How were the massive granite blocks that form the King's Chamber transported from quarries at Aswan, some 500 miles to the south? How were they lifted into position more than 100 feet above the ground? The standard explanations involve ramps of various configurations, but every proposed ramp design requires so much material and labour to construct that the cure seems worse than the disease it aims to treat. How was the precision achieved? The casting of limestone concrete, the use of lost technologies, the assistance of forces unknown to modern physics have all been proposed, each explanation raising its own questions, none fully satisfying. And why? What compelled an ancient civilization to pour such staggering resources into the construction of monuments that, if we accept the conventional explanation, served primarily as royal tombs? Egypt built smaller pyramids before and after Giza, structures that could have served the same funerary function at a fraction of the cost. What made the Great Pyramid necessary? The plateau keeps its secrets, and the shadows grow long as the sun begins its descent toward the western desert. We have only begun to scratch the surface of the questions that wait here, only started to trace the threads that connect this place to others scattered across the globe. Monuments that share alignments, proportions, construction methods, and mysteries that suggest connections, influences, or inheritances we do not fully understand. But the light is fading, and there is so much more to see. The drowned cities still called from beneath the waves, the burned libraries still smoulder in memory, the underground worlds still wait in patient darkness, and the artefacts, the impossible objects that refuse to fit their assigned timelines, still sit in their cases, challenging anyone who looks closely to explain how they came to be. This journey has only begun. The shadows deepen, and within them the forbidden truths continue to wait. Far to the east of the Giza Plateau, across the sweep of the Arabian Desert and the waters of the Persian Gulf, lies a landscape that few tourists ever visit, a region of rugged mountains and deep valleys carved by ancient rivers long since vanished into memory. The country of Oman guards its secrets well, its interior territories isolated by geography and climate, its ancient past only now yielding to the patient work of archaeologists who have begun to realise that this corner of the world holds surprises that textbooks never prepared them for. In a site known as Al Ain, nestled against the flanks of Jebel Misht, stand the remains of beehive tombs that predate the pyramids of Egypt by centuries. These are not rough cairns or simple stone piles, but carefully constructed monuments, their walls curving inward with precise geometry, their interiors organised according to principles that suggest complex beliefs about death and what lies beyond it. The tombs cluster together on a ridge overlooking a landscape that was once far greener than the barren terrain we see today. A land of seasonal rivers and scattered forests, where early communities established trade networks that would eventually stretch across the known world. Archaeologists date these structures to approximately 3,000 years before the Common Era, placing them among the oldest monumental architecture in the Arabian Peninsula, contemporary with the earliest pyramid experiments in Egypt and the ziggurat traditions taking shape in Mesopotamia. Yet the beehive tombs of Oman rarely appear in surveys of ancient architecture. They do not feature in documentaries about the origins of civilization. They exist in a kind of scholarly shadow, acknowledged by specialists but absent from the broader narratives we tell ourselves about human development. Why? Part of the answer lies in the biases that shaped archaeological practice during its formative years. The scholars who established the frameworks we still use today were products of European colonial powers, their interests directed towards civilizations that could be claimed as intellectual ancestors, cultures that contributed to what they saw as the march of progress culminating in their own societies. Egypt was claimed through Greece, which had claimed Egypt through Alexander. Mesopotamia was claimed through the Bible, which provided a familiar narrative framework. But Oman and the broader regions of the Arabian Peninsula fit less neatly into these stories. The civilizations that rose and fell there left records in languages that European scholars could not immediately read, built monuments in styles that did not connect obviously to Greek temples or Gothic cathedrals, and practiced beliefs that seemed alien to the religious traditions familiar to 19th century academics. So the beehive tombs waited, their stones slowly weathering under the desert sun, their secrets preserved precisely because no one thought to disturb them. When serious archaeological work finally began in the region during the latter decades of the 20th century, researchers found far more than they expected. The tombs were not isolated monuments, but part of extensive networks of settlements, irrigation systems, and trade routes that connected the interior of Arabia with the civilizations of the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, and possibly even Egypt. Copper from Omani mines has been found in artifacts recovered from Ur, suggesting that the merchants of this forgotten land supplied the raw materials that powered the bronze industries of the Fertile Crescent. Incense roads carried frankincense and myrrh northward from the Dhofar region, commodities so valuable that ancient texts speak of them in terms usually reserved for gold and precious stones. Yet the people who established these networks, who built the beehive tombs and organised the mining operations and navigated the trade routes, left no written records that we have yet deciphered. They exist in our historical awareness primarily through the objects they left behind, and the brief mentions that appear in the records of their trading partners. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what gods they worshipped or what stories they told around their fires at night. We know only that they were here, that they built, that they traded, and that they eventually vanished into the long silence that separates the ancient past from the historical present. The beehive tombs stand as monuments to this forgetting, their curving walls enclosing empty chambers where once the bones of honoured dead were laid to rest, with offerings meant to sustain them on journeys we can no longer map. Moving northward from the Arabian Peninsula, crossing the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, and climbing into the highlands of what is now Turkey, we encounter a site that has fundamentally rewritten our understanding of when and why humans first began to build monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe rises from the rolling hills of southeastern Anatolia like a question mark carved in stone, its massive T-shaped pillars arranged in circles that predate the earliest known agriculture by centuries. For generations, archaeologists believed that monumental architecture required settled agricultural communities, that only the surplus food production made possible by farming could support the specialised labour needed to quarry, transport and erect massive stone monuments. Göbekli Tepe shatters this assumption. The site dates to approximately 10,000 years before the Common Era, a time when the people of this region were still hunter-gatherers, still following the seasonal movements of game and the ripening of wild plants, still living in patterns that, according to conventional wisdom, should have left no trace larger than scattered campsites and the bones of their meals. Yet here they are, limestone pillars weighing up to 20 tons, carved with intricate reliefs depicting animals both familiar and fantastical, arranged in circles that align with celestial phenomena, constructed and reconstructed over centuries before being deliberately buried beneath tons of rubble in a final act whose purpose remains entirely mysterious. The mainstream interpretation holds that Göbekli Tepe was a ritual centre, a place of gathering and ceremony for hunter-gatherer bands who travelled from across the region to participate in events whose specific nature we can only guess at. The carvings on the pillars support this reading, depicting foxes and boars and snakes and birds, creatures that may have held totemic significance for the groups who gathered here. Yet this explanation raises as many questions as it answers. How was the labour organised? Hunter-gatherer societies typically operate in small mobile bands, their social structures fluid and egalitarian, their decision-making processes based on consensus rather than command. The construction of Göbekli Tepe required coordinated effort on a scale that seems to demand hierarchy, specialisation, and planning horizons extending over multiple generations. Did the building of the monument itself catalyse social changes that we have traditionally attributed to agriculture? Did people come together to build, and in the building, discover new ways of organising themselves that would eventually lead to the settled communities that emerged in subsequent millennia? The pillars offer no answers, their T-shapes suggesting stylised human forms, arms carved along their sides, belts and loincloths indicated in the stone, yet no faces, no features, no expressions that might tell us who they were meant to represent. And then there is the burial. At some point, roughly 1,000 years after construction began, the people of this region deliberately filled in the circles, covering the pillars beneath thousands of tons of earth and stone, preserving them with a care that suggests intentionality rather than abandonment. Were they sealing something away, protecting something from a coming catastrophe, marking a transition from one age to another? The fill material contains no artifacts that might help date or explain the burial. The earth simply accumulated layer after layer until the pillars vanished beneath the hills, their locations forgotten for millennia, until a Kurdish shepherd noticed strange stones protruding from the soil in 1963 and eventually brought them to the attention of archaeologists who recognised what had been found. Today, excavations continue at Göbekli Tepe, each season revealing new pillars, new carvings, new mysteries. Geophysical surveys suggest that what has been uncovered represents perhaps 5% of the total site. Beneath the hills, arranged in patterns we have not yet mapped, wait structures that may transform our understanding once again. The Earth remembers, even when we forget. The pattern repeats across continents, in places separated by oceans and millennia, sites that share characteristics difficult to explain through coincidence alone. In the highlands of Peru, at an altitude where the air thins and every breath becomes an effort, stand the walls of Sacsayhuaman, a fortress or temple or something else entirely, its massive stones fitted together with a precision that defies the tools its builders supposedly possessed. The largest stones weigh over 200 tons, their surfaces carved into complex interlocking shapes that fit together without mortar, their joints so tight that even today, 5 centuries after the Spanish conquest sought to dismantle them for building materials, a knife blade cannot penetrate the seams. Mainstream archaeology attributes these walls to the Inca Empire, which rose to prominence in the 15th century of the Common Era and fell to Pizarro's conquistadors less than 100 years later. The Inca were master builders, their road systems spanning thousands of miles, their administrative centres demonstrating sophisticated understanding of logistics and engineering. Yet even they, according to some accounts, claimed that the oldest walls of Sacsayhuaman were not their work, that they had found the massive stones already in place and simply built upon foundations laid by earlier peoples whose names had been lost even to local memory. The Spanish chroniclers who recorded these accounts had their own biases, their own agendas, their own reasons for emphasising the antiquity and mystery of the structures they encountered. But the stones themselves testify to techniques that seem to exceed what we know of Inca capabilities. The famous 12-angled stone of Cusco, fitted into a wall with corners and joints that would challenge a modern stonemason working with power tools and laser levels, exemplifies the problem. How was this precision achieved? The conventional answer involves patient work with hammerstones and bronze tools, years of effort by skilled craftsmen who shaped each block to fit its neighbours through trial and error. Yet, experiments attempting to replicate these techniques have struggled to achieve comparable results, the modern stones fitting well enough but lacking the uncanny perfection of the originals, and the size remains unexplained. 200 tons is not a weight that can be moved by pulling on ropes, not in terrain this rugged, not at altitudes where even modern workers tire quickly. The Inca left no written records, their system of knotted cords called quipu encoding numerical and possibly narrative information in ways we have not fully deciphered. Whatever they knew about the walls they built or claimed to have found, they took with them into the silence that followed the conquest. The stones' weight, their surfaces weathered by 5 centuries of rain and frost, and the touch of countless tourists' hands. Their secrets as secure today as when the last mason set down his tools and stepped back to survey his work. Half a world away, on an island that modern maps label Easter Island but whose inhabitants called it Rapa Nui, stand the famous moai, massive stone heads that gaze inland across a landscape stripped bare by environmental catastrophe and the colonial violence that followed. Everyone knows the moai. They have become icons of mystery, their brooding features gracing countless documentaries and speculative books about ancient civilizations and lost knowledge. The mainstream explanation is well established. The Moai were carved by the Polynesian settlers who reached this remote island sometime around the 12th century of the Common Era, their isolation allowing unique cultural developments that produced these distinctive monuments. The statues were carved from compressed volcanic ash at the quarry of Ranararaku, then transported to platforms called ahu around the island's perimeter, using a combination of wooden sledges, log rollers, and human muscle power. The process required deforestation on a massive scale. The island's palm forests sacrificed to provide the timber needed for transport, a sacrifice that eventually rendered the land unable to support its population and led to societal collapse well before European contact added new pressures of disease, slavery, and cultural suppression. This is the story usually told, a cautionary tale about the consequences of environmental overexploitation, a parable for our own age of ecological anxiety. Yet details complicate this narrative. The Moai at Ranararaku include statues far larger than any that were successfully transported, suggesting either abandoned projects or evidence of techniques that did not rely on log rollers at all. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that the statues could be moved by walking them, teams of workers rocking them forward in a motion that matches local oral traditions describing how the Moai walked to their platforms. But the largest completed Moai weighs over 80 tons, a mass that seems to exceed what any walking technique could reasonably manage. And then there are the hats, the red stone cylinders called pukao that crown many of the standing Moai, each one weighing several tons, each one somehow lifted and placed atop statues that already stood over 30 feet tall. Cranes, ramps, techniques that left no archaeological trace. The questions accumulate like the carved figures that still lie half buried in the quarry, projects abandoned midway through, their intended destinations never reached, their purposes never fulfilled. The parallel features are what haunt the careful observer. At Sacsayhuaman, at Easter Island, at Göbekli Tepe, at Giza, we find massive stone construction using blocks that exceed practical transport and placement with known ancient technologies. We find precision fitting that challenges the supposed toolkits of the builders. We find alignments, astronomical and geometric, that suggest sophisticated understanding of mathematics and observation. And we find silence, the absence of records explaining how these things were accomplished, the loss of knowledge that should have been passed down, the suspicious gaps in cultural continuity that leave us guessing about capabilities that clearly once existed. The conventional explanations are not impossible. Enough workers, enough time, enough organisational skill can accomplish remarkable things, as the modern world demonstrates daily with its own monuments of steel and glass and concrete. But the conventional explanations require us to accept that multiple civilizations, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, independently developed similar techniques, achieved similar results, and then lost or abandoned this knowledge so completely that we struggle to replicate it today. What inheritance might account for these parallels? What older tradition might have seeded these skills across the world? The questions press against the boundaries of acceptable speculation, threatening to spill into territories that mainstream scholarship prefers to avoid. Beneath the waters of the Mediterranean, off the coast of the Greek island of Antikythera, divers in 1900 discovered the wreck of a Roman-era vessel that would eventually yield an object so anomalous that scholars initially refused to believe their own analysis. The Antikythera mechanism, as it came to be known, is a corroded lump of bronze about the size of a shoebox, its surface encrusted with marine growth and mineral deposits, its original function invisible to casual examination. But X-ray analysis and careful cleaning revealed something extraordinary. A complex system of interlocking gears, at least 30 of them, arranged to model the motions of the sun and moon, to predict eclipses, and to track the cycles of the Olympic Games. Nothing like it would appear in the historical record for another 1400 years. The mechanism dates to approximately 100 years before the Common Era, contemporary with the late Roman Republic, a time when the most sophisticated computing devices were supposed to be counting boards and basic abacuses. Yet here was a mechanical computer, its gears cut with precision that implies specialized manufacturing equipment, its functions requiring mathematical understanding that we typically attribute to much later periods. The mainstream explanation holds that the mechanism represents the pinnacle of Hellenistic astronomical knowledge, a singular achievement by a genius whose name has been lost, a technology that died with its creator because the conditions for its reproduction did not exist in the ancient world. This is possible. History is full of one-off inventions that failed to propagate, ideas that arrived before their time and vanished without issue. But the mechanism's sophistication implies a tradition, a lineage of development that should have left other traces. Gears do not spring fully formed from the minds of solitary inventors. They require generations of experimentation, incremental improvements, failed prototypes, and successful iterations that leave their marks on the archaeological record. Where are the simpler mechanisms that preceded the Antikythera device? Where are the workshop fragments, the instructional texts, the references in contemporary literature to the craft of making such things? The silence is suspicious. Either this technology developed in isolation and vanished without descendants, or it developed from traditions we have not yet discovered, traditions that may predate our comfortable assumptions about when such knowledge became possible. The pattern extends to materials as well as mechanisms. In the archaeological museums of Baghdad, before the looting that accompanied recent conflicts, researchers studied a collection of artifacts that became known as the Baghdad batteries. These are small clay jars, dating to the Parthian period around 2,000 years ago, containing copper cylinders and iron rods, arranged in a configuration that, when filled with acidic liquid such as vinegar or grape juice, generates a small electrical current. The voltage is minimal, perhaps a volt or two, insufficient for any practical application that modern minds can readily imagine. Yet the configuration is unmistakable. These are not random assemblages of materials, but deliberate constructions whose purpose involved the generation of electricity 2 millennia before Volta's pile. What were they for? The conventional speculation involves electroplating, the deposition of thin metal layers onto objects for decorative purposes. Experiments have demonstrated that the batteries could indeed plate small objects with gold or silver, providing a possible function that fits within the technological context of the period. But no electroplated objects from this region and era have been definitively identified. No texts describe the process or explain how to construct the devices. No workshop debris reveals the production context. The batteries exist in isolation, their function reconstructed from first principles rather than historical evidence, their true purpose as mysterious as the day they were first recognized for what they are. We could continue this catalogue indefinitely. The Iron Pillar of Delhi, standing in the open air for 16 centuries without significant rust, its metallurgical composition, including phosphorus levels that somehow inhibit corrosion, through mechanisms that modern materials scientists are only beginning to understand. The concrete of the Roman Pantheon, still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world after 2,000 years, its recipe lost when the empire fell and not rediscovered until modern times, and even now not fully replicated in its durability and self-healing properties. The Damascus steel of medieval swords, with its distinctive patterns and legendary cutting ability, manufactured by techniques that became extinct in the 18th century and have never been successfully reproduced despite intensive study. The Greek fire of Byzantine warfare, a liquid incendiary weapon that burned on water and could not be extinguished by normal means, its formula so secret that it died with the empire itself. Each of these represents knowledge that was gained and then lost, capabilities that existed and then vanished, technologies that flowered briefly and then withered without leaving seeds. The pattern suggests something troubling about the nature of human knowledge itself. We like to imagine progress as a steady upward climb, each generation building on the achievements of those who came before, knowledge accumulating like sediment in a riverbed, never decreasing, always growing. But the archaeological record tells a different story. Knowledge can be lost. Skills can die with their practitioners. Libraries can burn. Conquests can sever the transmission of tradition from master to apprentice. Plagues can empty workshops. Religious prohibitions can suppress experimentation. Economic collapses can end the patronage that supports specialized crafts. And sometimes knowledge simply becomes unnecessary, its practitioners finding easier paths to similar results, its techniques abandoned not because they failed, but because alternatives proved more convenient. The Roman concrete that built the Pantheon was replaced by medieval mortars, because the volcanic ash it required was not available everywhere the empire's successors wanted to build. The Damascus steel was abandoned because crucible production could not match the industrial scale of modern steelmaking. The Greek fire was forgotten because gunpowder provided similar advantages without the mystery. Each loss was reasonable in its moment, a practical choice made by practical people responding to immediate circumstances. But the cumulative effect is a kind of erosion, a slow forgetting that leaves us poorer than our ancestors in ways we rarely acknowledge. The beehive tombs of Oman stand as monuments to builders whose names we will never know. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe preserve the visions of peoples whose voices we will never hear. The walls of Sacsayhuaman display techniques we cannot replicate, carved by hands whose owners left no record of their methods. And beneath the waves, sunk in harbours and scattered across seabeds, lie the remains of civilizations that flourished and faded before anyone thought to write their stories down. The drowned cities call to us still, their streets and temples and marketplaces preserved in the cold darkness where currents shift the silt and occasionally reveal what was hidden. Off the coast of Japan, divers have explored structures that some claim are the remains of a civilization that flourished before the end of the last ice age, when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than today and coastlines extended miles beyond their present positions. The Yonaguni Monument rises from the seafloor like a challenge to everything we think we know about the timeline of human civilization. Discovered in 1987 by a diving instructor searching for new sites to show tourists, these massive stone formations off the southern tip of Japan's Ryukyu Islands have sparked one of the most contentious debates in underwater archaeology. Terraced platforms descend in regular steps. Right angles meet at corners too precise for comfortable dismissal. What appear to be roadways connect what might be plazas. Structures that resemble altars or platforms rise from bases that look deliberately levelled. The conventional explanation holds that these formations are entirely natural, the product of the sandstone's tendency to fracture along regular planes, creating geometric shapes that merely suggest human handiwork. And it is true that nature can produce remarkable regularity, that columnar basalt and crystalline formations and sedimentary layering can fool the eye into seeing intention where only physics operates. Yet certain features of the Yonaguni Monument resist such easy categorization. The twin megaliths that stand like guardians at what some call a gateway, the circular depressions that look like they were carved to hold posts, the channel that runs along what appears to be a processional way, the face-like formation that gazes upward from the depths, its features eroded but still recognizable, still disturbing in their suggestion of deliberate carving. If these structures are artificial, they present a profound problem of dating. The rock itself is millions of years old, but when might humans have worked it? Sea levels in this region have fluctuated dramatically over geological time. The last time these formations stood above water was approximately 10,000 years ago, at the end of the Pleistocene, when the last ice age was releasing its grip on the world and melting glaciers were pouring fresh water into rising oceans. 10,000 years ago, conventional archaeology tells us, humans in this region were hunter-gatherers, nomadic peoples following game and gathering plants, without the social organization or technological capability to carve massive monuments from living rock. Yet someone, somewhere, was building Göbekli Tepe at precisely this time, proving that our assumptions about the capabilities of pre-agricultural peoples require revision. Could there have been other centres of early complexity, other places where humans organised themselves into groups capable of monumental construction, other experiments in civilization that left no written records and few traces? The Yonaguni Monument cannot prove this hypothesis. The evidence is too ambiguous, the geological explanations too plausible, the signs of human modification too easily attributed to the pareidolia that makes us see faces in clouds and figures in rock formations. But it reminds us that the seafloor conceals vast territories that were once dry land, that coastlines where ancient peoples would logically have concentrated, building their settlements near the resources of the sea, now lie beneath hundreds of feet of water. What civilizations might have flourished in these drowned lowlands? What cities might rest beneath the waves, their streets walked by fish, their temples colonized by coral, their monuments slowly dissolving into the salt darkness? We will likely never know. The ocean keeps its secrets well, and yet, occasionally, the sea yields glimpses of what it has taken. In the Gulf of Kambat, off the western coast of India, sonar surveys in 2001 revealed what appeared to be the remains of a city lying beneath 120 feet of water. The structures extended across an area of several square miles, showing what looked like streets, building foundations, drainage channels, and what might have been a citadel. Dredging operations recovered artifacts including pottery, beads, sculpture fragments, and human teeth, along with wood that carbon dating placed at approximately 9,000 years old. If these dates are accurate, and if the structures are indeed artificial, they would predate the Indus Valley civilization by 5,000 years, suggesting that complex urban societies developed in South Asia far earlier than anyone had suspected. The site, if it is a site, remains controversial. Some archaeologists dismiss the sonar images as natural formations, the artifacts as objects washed out to sea from later coastal settlements, the dating as contaminated by older carbon deposits. Others argue that the geometric regularity of the features, the concentration of artifacts, and the depth of the water strongly suggest human occupation of a now submerged landscape. The truth may never be established with certainty. Underwater excavation at such depths is extraordinarily difficult and expensive. The murky waters of the Gulf offer limited visibility. Currents and sediment pose constant challenges, and the academic establishment, perhaps understandably, is reluctant to commit resources to investigating claims that would, if confirmed, overturn fundamental assumptions about the development of human civilization. The drowned city of Kambat, if it exists, may remain forever in scholarly limbo, neither confirmed nor refuted, a tantalizing possibility that hovers at the edge of the historical record. Similar enigmas beckon from coastal waters around the world. Off the coast of Cuba in 2001, a Canadian exploration company using sonar to search for sunken Spanish galleons detected geometric structures lying more than 2,000 feet below the surface. The images showed what appeared to be pyramids, circular structures, and rectangular buildings arranged in an orderly fashion across the seafloor. The depth posed an immediate problem for any archaeological interpretation. 2,000 feet is far deeper than sea levels have fluctuated in human history. For these structures to have been built on dry land, they would have to date from an epoch so remote that it seems impossible to reconcile with anything we know about human development. The Cuban government permitted limited investigation, but geopolitical tensions and the extreme technical challenges of working at such depths prevented systematic study. The structures remain unexplored, their nature unconfirmed, their origins unknown. They might be natural formations, volcanic or geological features that merely suggest artificial regularity. They might be the remains of some ancient construction, built on land that subsequently subsided dramatically due to seismic activity. They might be something else entirely, something our current categories cannot accommodate. Without excavation, without artifacts, without datable material, we simply cannot know. And so another mystery joins the catalogue of the possibly impossible, awaiting future technologies and future investigators who may finally determine what lies in the darkness of the Caribbean deep. The pattern that emerges from these underwater anomalies is consistent with patterns we observe on land. Structures that seem too old, too sophisticated, too precisely constructed for the peoples who supposedly built them. Knowledge that appears suddenly without clear developmental precursors and sometimes vanishes equally suddenly without descendants or successors. Civilizations that flourished and faded in the margins of the historical record, leaving traces that conventional scholarship struggles to interpret. And always, hovering at the edge of discussion, the uncomfortable question of what might have been lost, what might have been suppressed, what might have been forgotten before anyone thought to remember. The pattern grows more troubling when we consider not just what was lost through the accidents of time and nature, but what was actively destroyed by human agency. The burning of libraries, the suppression of texts, the deliberate obliteration of knowledge deemed dangerous or heretical. These represent wounds to human memory that can never fully heal. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria, that symbol of ancient learning whose loss we still mourn 2 millennia later, was only the most famous of countless such tragedies. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the greatest library of the medieval Islamic world, was destroyed when the Mongols sacked the city in 1258, its books thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that the water ran black with ink for days. The libraries of Nalanda, the great Buddhist university in India, burned for 3 months when Muslim invaders conquered the region in the 12th century, their flames consuming works of philosophy, science, medicine and mathematics accumulated over centuries of scholarship. The Maya codices, those painted books that recorded the history, astronomy, mathematics, and religious beliefs of one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient Americas, were systematically destroyed by Spanish missionaries who saw them as works of the devil. Of the thousands of codices that existed before the conquest, only 4 survive, and even these are fragmentary, damaged, and imperfectly understood. What knowledge perished in those flames? What calendar calculations? What astronomical observations? What historical records? What mathematical insights were reduced to ash because foreign priests decided they were evil? We will never know. The fire keeps no inventory of what it consumes. And then there are the suppressions that occurred not through conquest or zealotry, but through the quieter processes of institutional control and scholarly gatekeeping. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in caves near Qumran between 1947 and 1956, were controlled for decades by a small team of scholars who restricted access to the manuscripts and published their findings with agonizing slowness. Only in 1991, after more than 40 years of scholarly monopoly, were photographs of all the scrolls finally made available to the general public. During those 4 decades, what interpretations were suppressed? What connections to other texts were not explored? What hypotheses were not permitted to be tested because access to the primary evidence was denied? The official explanation for the delay emphasized the difficulty of the material, the fragmentary condition of many scrolls, the need for careful conservation and expert analysis. But others have suggested that the content of certain scrolls posed challenges to established religious narratives that powerful institutions preferred to manage quietly rather than confront openly. Whether such suggestions have merit, the episode illustrates how control over access to ancient materials can shape what knowledge emerges into public consciousness, and what remains buried, if not in the ground, then in the archives of institutions with their own agendas and interests. The Nag Hammadi Library presents a parallel case with different dimensions. These Coptic manuscripts, discovered by Egyptian farmers in 1945, included texts that the early Christian Church had attempted to suppress, alternative gospels and philosophical treatises that presented versions of early Christianity radically different from the orthodoxy that eventually prevailed. The Gospel of Thomas, with its collection of sayings attributed to Jesus, many of which have no parallel in the canonical Gospels. The Gospel of Philip, with its enigmatic references to Mary Magdalene and its metaphysical speculations. The Apocryphon of John, with its elaborate cosmology of emanations and archons. These texts were not destroyed by accident. They were deliberately hidden, probably by monks who buried them to protect them from the book burnings that accompanied the enforcement of orthodox belief in late antiquity. The Christians, who won the theological battles of the 4th and 5th centuries, did not merely argue their opponents into submission. They burned their books, demolished their meeting places, and eventually made it illegal to possess texts deemed heretical. The Nag Hammadi library survived only because someone chose to hide it rather than surrender it, placing the manuscripts in a sealed jar and burying them in the Egyptian desert, where the dry climate preserved them for 16 centuries until their accidental rediscovery. How many other such caches were successfully destroyed? How many alternative visions of Christianity, alternative readings of the life of Jesus, alternative theologies and cosmologies perished because the victors in ecclesiastical struggles enforced their victory with fire as well as argument? The texts that survived are surely only a fraction of what once existed, random survivors of a systematic campaign of intellectual destruction. We find similar patterns wherever religious or political authority has sought to control the boundaries of acceptable knowledge. The Index of Forbidden Books, maintained by the Catholic Church from the 16th century until 1966, listed thousands of works that faithful Catholics were prohibited from reading without special permission. The list included not only theological works deemed heretical, but also scientific treatises, philosophical investigations, and literary works that challenged church teaching, or simply explored ideas the hierarchy found uncomfortable. Galileo's Dialogue, concerning the 2 chief world systems, remained on the index until 1835, more than 2 centuries after its publication, more than a century and a half after the scientific revolution had definitively established the heliocentric model it defended. How much scientific progress was delayed by such prohibitions? How many potential investigators were discouraged from pursuing lines of research that the Church had declared off limits? How many ideas that might have transformed human understanding were stillborn because the institutional structures that controlled education and publication refused them space to develop? And yet, despite everything, despite the fires and the floods and the conquests and the suppressions, knowledge has a way of persisting. Manuscripts were copied and hidden. Techniques were passed from master to apprentice in secret. Oral traditions preserved what written records had lost. And sometimes, centuries or millennia later, what was buried rose again to the surface. What was hidden was found. What was silent began to speak once more. The Renaissance itself was powered in part by the rediscovery of classical texts that had been preserved in Arabic translations while Europe forgot them, works of philosophy and science and mathematics that transformed Western thought when they finally returned to the languages from which they had originally come. The lost works of Aristotle, preserved by Arab scholars and translated into Latin in the 12th and 13th centuries, helped spark the intellectual revolution that eventually produced modern science. The astronomical observations of Islamic scholars, building on Greek foundations and extending them with original contributions, provided crucial data for the Copernican revolution. Knowledge that the Christian West had abandoned was kept alive in the Islamic East and eventually restored, changed but recognizable, transformed but still bearing the marks of its ancient origins. This pattern of loss and recovery, of forgetting and rediscovering, suggests that human knowledge is more resilient than we sometimes fear and more fragile than we often assume. The library may burn, but someone, somewhere, may have made a copy. The technique may be abandoned, but the products that demonstrate its possibility survive, challenging future generations to rediscover what was forgotten. The truth may be suppressed, but it has a way of working itself free, emerging in unexpected places, speaking through unexpected voices, refusing to stay buried no matter how many stones are piled upon its grave. Standing at the end of this long journey, through the shadowed corners of human history, we find ourselves confronted with a question that has no easy answer. What should we make of all these mysteries, all these anomalies, all these traces of knowledge that was and is no longer? The skeptic in us insists on caution. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The fact that we cannot explain something does not mean it is inexplicable. The gaps in our knowledge are not proof of hidden wisdom. They are simply gaps, the inevitable result of the incompleteness of the archaeological record, the ravages of time, the limitations of preservation, the biases of discovery. And the skeptic has a point. Too many people have filled those gaps with fantasies, projecting their own desires onto the blank spaces of the past, finding ancient astronauts in every ambiguous carving, lost continents beneath every wave, secret cabals behind every unexplained disappearance. The history of alternative archaeology is littered with frauds and fantasies, with well-meaning enthusiasts who were fooled by their own hopes, and charlatans who deliberately exploited the credulity of others. We should approach these mysteries with humility, acknowledging the limits of what we can know, while resisting the temptation to fill those limits with speculation dressed as certainty. And yet, there remains something unsatisfying about a purely dismissive approach. The beehive tombs of Oman really are extraordinary. The precision of Sacsayhuaman really does resist easy replication. The dating of Göbekli Tepe really did overturn fundamental assumptions about the timeline of human development. The fact that some claims about the past are false does not mean all claims are false. The fact that some mysteries have prosaic explanations does not mean all mysteries will yield to prosaic investigation. The history of science is full of phenomena that were dismissed as impossible or fraudulent, or simply mistaken, until they were confirmed by evidence too strong to ignore. Continental drift was considered geological heresy until plate tectonics made it orthodoxy. Meteorites were dismissed as peasant superstition until enough witnesses and enough specimens forced acceptance. The existence of giant squid was relegated to sailors' tales until cameras finally captured what sailors had been reporting for centuries. Perhaps the most honest response to the mysteries we have explored is neither credulous acceptance nor reflexive dismissal, but a kind of humble openness. We do not know everything. We cannot know everything. The past is vast and we are small, our instruments limited, our assumptions often wrong, our confident narratives constantly being revised by new discoveries. Every generation of archaeologists has had to unlearn things the previous generation believed with certainty. Every decade brings discoveries that challenge established timelines, upset comfortable categories, force reconsideration of what seemed settled. The responsible approach is not to pretend we have all the answers, nor to abandon the pursuit of answers in favour of uncritical wonder, but to hold our theories lightly, to remain alert for evidence that challenges them, to remember that the map is not the territory and the textbook is not the past. The forbidden histories we have traced, the sunken cities and burned libraries and impossible artefacts and suppressed traditions. They remind us that human knowledge is neither as secure nor as complete as we sometimes imagine. Civilizations rise and fall, technologies are invented and forgotten, wisdom is accumulated and lost, libraries burn and the ash blows away on winds that do not pause to mourn what has been destroyed. But through it all, the stones remain, the artefacts endure, the traces persist, waiting in the earth, waiting beneath the waves, waiting in the fragments, and the rumours, and the half-remembered stories that people tell when the official histories fall silent. We have walked together through the unseen pages of the past, through places where every stone holds secrets, where every symbol preserves a message from hands we will never touch, where every silence echoes with voices we will never hear. We have stood in tombs that defy the technologies of their eras, descended into caves whose paintings preserve the visions of peoples dead for 20,000 years, traced the walls of fortresses that no modern method can reproduce. We have followed the whispers of knowledge hidden, lost, and quietly erased. And at the end of this long journey, we find that the mystery remains. The questions persist. The past keeps its counsel, revealing only fragments, offering only glimpses, inviting our investigation while refusing our certainty. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be embraced. The past will never fully surrender its secrets. There will always be another tomb beneath the sand, another city beneath the waves, another manuscript in a forgotten archive, another tradition preserved by peoples who never wrote their wisdom down. The horizon of the unknown recedes as we advance, always staying just beyond our reach, always calling us forward into darkness that yields slowly, reluctantly, incompletely to our light. The forbidden past does not ask for our belief. It asks only for our attention. It asks that we not turn away too quickly from what we do not understand. It asks that we hold space for possibilities that our current categories cannot contain. It asks that we remember those who came before, whose names we will never know, whose achievements we can barely comprehend, whose knowledge was buried by time and conquest, and the simple forgetting that comes when no one is left to remember. In their silence, in the stones they shaped and the objects they crafted and the structures they raised against the sky, they speak still to those who have ears to hear, and in listening, in wondering, in refusing the easy comfort of premature certainty, we honour them and the vast, strange, beautiful mystery of the human story, written and unwritten, remembered and forgotten, known and forever unknowable. The stones keep their secrets, the silence holds its truths, and we, standing at the edge of all we do not know, can only look into the darkness and wonder and remember that even now, somewhere beneath our feet or beneath the waves or beneath the ruins of libraries long burned, the past is waiting, always waiting, to be found, to be understood, to be remembered, and perhaps, one day, to be spoken again.